G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Footsteps of the Messiah. This is a study of the last days. Now, in the last session, we finished off with the first stage of the campaign of Armageddon, which was the assembling of the allies of the Antichrist. Campaign of Armageddon will begin with the sixth bowl judgment. This is with the outpouring of the bowl judgment. And what happens is the Euphrates River gets dried up. Now, while Satan and the Antichrist gather the nations for the purpose of destroying the Jews, God has his own very different purpose for permitting this deployment to take place. God's viewpoint is one of mockery. The nations are derisively encouraged to go ahead and turn their farming equipment into weapons of war. As for those who are weak, let them persuade themselves and pretend that they are strong. Now we come to session 16 here, and we're now looking at, and we're still in the events of the second half of the tribulation. Now we're looking at the second stage. The second stage is the destruction of Babylon. Now, we covered earlier the requirement for the city of Babylon to be rebuilt, and it becomes the world capital of the Antichrist. Babylon will be the international political capital. It will also become the economic capital of the world. And we find this in the vision of Zechariah, in Zechariah 5, verses 5 to 11. Zechariah sees this vision, and he asked in verse 6, he asked, "What is it?" And he, that's the angel, said, "This is the ephah that goes forth." He said, "Moreover, this is their appearance in all the land." And verse 7, "Behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead, and this is a woman sitting in the midst of the ephah." Now, the ephah was a Hebrew measure of weight, and it became the symbol of economy. As seen in this vision here, this symbol is a corrupted one because lead has now been added to it, giving it a false measure. The angel goes on to say that this is wickedness. This is this woman sitting in the ephah. This ephah, which is like a basket, is then lifted up and carried away. In verse 10, "Then said I to the angel that talked with me, Whither do these bear the ephah? And he said unto me, To build her a house in the land of Shinar. And when it is prepared, she shall be set there in her own place." So what we see here is that this corrupted weight is with the woman in this basket is now taken to the land of Shinar, which is the same as Babylonia. It's an area in modern day southern Iraq. So what we're going to see is that the future center of the world economy will be set there in her own place. That is in the rebuilt city of Babylon. Throughout the second half of the tribulation, Babylon will be both the center of world economy and international politics. Now, in this second stage of the campaign of Armageddon, the city will suffer a sudden destruction. And we're going to look at several key scriptures which will now cover this. First passage we look at is Isaiah chapter 13, verse 1 to chapter 14, verse 23. We find the means of destruction in chapter 13, verses 1 to 5. Isaiah writes, "The burden of Babylon," which Isaiah, the son of Amos, did see. This is verse 1. "The burden of Babylon that Isaiah saw was another gathering of many peoples." In the first stage of the campaign of Armageddon, we saw the gathering of the pro-Babylon or pro-Antichrist forces. Now, what we're seeing here in this vision of Isaiah is the gathering of the opposing forces. Isaiah 13, verse 3. I have commanded my consecrated ones, yes, I have called my mighty men for my anger, even my proudly exulting ones. Now, God has called these people, and their purpose will be to destroy the city. And here we see God calls them God's consecrated ones. So this shows that God will use Gentile believers to destroy Babylon. Now, consecrated ones, it could mean just simply set apart ones, but probably or most likely in this context, it is Gentile believers. And we see here it's the noise of a tumult of the kingdoms of the nations gathered together. Jehovah of hosts is mustering the host for the battle, the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Now, the details of this destruction of Babylon are given in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 6 to Isaiah 14, verse 23. Now, as we look at this, we've got to remember that this prophecy has never, ever been fulfilled in the manner that this text talks about. Now, the context of Isaiah 13, 6 to 22 clearly puts the destruction of Babylon, announced in verses 1 to 5, within the time of the day of Jehovah. Remember, the day of Jehovah is a reference to the Great Tribulation. Now, for the purpose of Israel's restoration, Babylon must be destroyed. So her destruction relates to the final redemption of Israel, which is described in chapter 14, verses 1 to 2 of Isaiah. Here, God makes good on his promises to bring Israel back to her land. Verse 1 of chapter 14, Isaiah. For Jehovah will have compassion on Jacob and will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land. Now, in verse 2, we see that the Gentiles will help bring the Jews back to their land. And the peoples, that's the Gentile nations, shall take them and bring them to their place. Isaiah 13, verse 19 to 22. Isaiah says here, Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. So what Isaiah is prophesying here is that Babylon will become similar to Sodom and Gomorrah in its final destruction. Verse 20, it shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation. So what's going to happen to it is that it will be fit for habitation by only the wild animals of the desert. No human will ever live there again after this destruction. 21 tells us, but wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and ostriches shall dwell there, and wild goats shall dance there. Babylon will be one of the two desolate spots in the Messianic kingdom. No human being will ever be able to live there anymore. Now, Isaiah's prophecy concerning Babylon ends in Isaiah 14, verses 22 to 23, where Isaiah states that unlike other nations, the entire population will be wiped out. It will not even have a surviving remnant. Verse 22, and I will rise up against them, says Jehovah of hosts, and cut off from Babylon name and remnant and son's son, says Jehovah. I will also make it a possession for the porcupine and pools of water. So what we see here is that Babylon is going to be a swamp fit only for desert animals. In addition to that, God is going to sweep it away with the broom of destruction. You might see the word besom there, that's broom. Now, Jeremiah, we're still in the second stage here of the campaign. Jeremiah is another prophet detailing the destruction of Babylon by a number of peoples. And he devotes chapters 50 and 51 to it, which are pretty long chapters. We're going to look at some of the key verses which portray the destruction of Babylon. In Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 1, the word that Jehovah spoke concerning Babylon, concerning the land of the Chaldeans, by Jeremiah the prophet. So here, Jeremiah points out that this prophecy is clearly pointing to Babylon. Now, as in Isaiah, Jeremiah chapter 50, verses 9 to 10, tells of a gathering of many peoples against the city of Babylon. Verse 9, for lo, I will stir up and cause to come against Babylon a company of great nations from the north country, and they shall set themselves in array against her. And then continue on in verse 10, and Chaldea shall be a prey. All that prey upon her shall be satisfied, says Jehovah. So the extent of this destruction and the warfare is described in Jeremiah chapter 50, verses 11 to 16. We'll just pick it up here in verse 12. Behold, she shall be the hindermost part of the nations, a wilderness, a dry land, and a desert. Because of the wrath of Jehovah, she shall not be inhabited, but she shall be wholly desolate. Everyone that goes by Babylon shall be astonished and hiss at all her plagues. Set yourselves in array against Babylon round about, all ye that bend the bow. Shoot at her, spare no arrows, for she has sinned against Jehovah. Shout against her round about. She has submitted herself. Her bulwarks are fallen. Her walls are thrown down. For it is the vengeance of Jehovah. Take vengeance upon her. As she has done, do unto her. Later on in Jeremiah 50, verses 21 to 27, there's a more graphic description of the fall of Babylon. We'll pick it up in verse 22. A sound of battle is in the land and of great destruction. How is the hammer of the whole earth cut asunder and broken? How has Babylon become a desolation among the nations? I have laid a snare for you, and you are also taken, O Babylon, and you were not aware. You are found and also caught, because you have striven against Jehovah. Jehovah has opened his armory and has brought forth the weapons of his indignation. For the Lord, Jehovah of hosts, has a work to do in the land of the Chaldeans. Verse 26, come against her from the utmost border, open her storehouses, cast her up as heaps, and destroy her utterly. Let nothing of her be left. The destruction of Babylon is to be total and final, so that the city will never be inhabited by man again. It will be as extensive as the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, according to Jeremiah 50, verses 39 to 40. Therefore, the wild beasts of the desert shall dwell therein, and it shall be no more inhabited forever. As when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, so shall no man dwell there, neither shall any son of man sojourn therein. Once again, Jeremiah speaks of a gathering of many peoples against Babylon in chapter 50, verses 41 to 42. Behold, a people comes from the north, and a great nation, and many kings shall be stirred up from the uttermost parts of the earth. And they ride upon horses, everyone set in array as a man to the battle against you, O daughter of Babylon. So here we see the nations gathering against Babylon. We now have a statement of God's decree against Babylon, along with the anguish of the nations over the destruction of their capital in Jeremiah 50, verses 45 to 46. Therefore, Hear ye the counsel of Jehovah, that he has taken against Babylon, and his purposes that he has purposed against the land of the Chaldeans. Surely they shall drag them away, even the little ones of the flock. Surely he shall make their habitation desolate over them. Verse 46 gives us the effects upon the world itself. At the noise of the taking of Babylon, the earth trembles, and the cry is heard among the nations. The fall of Babylon in Jeremiah 50 is followed by a more detailed description in Jeremiah 51. It will be Babylon's influence upon other nations that will cause God's judgment to fall on her. And this is according to Jeremiah 51, verses 7 to 9. Verse 7. Babylon has been a golden cup in Jehovah's hand that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunk of her wine. And the result of that was that those nations have become mad. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Jeremiah then goes on to say in verse 9, for her judgment reaches unto heaven and is lifted up even to the skies. Now, Babylon was the tool or the cup which God used to pour out his wrath upon other nations. Now, for you who may not know, whenever the cup is used symbolically throughout Scripture, it represents the wrath of God. And if you remember Jesus in Gethsemane, he says he prayed that this cup would be taken from him. It's the cup represents the wrath of God. And here, Babylon was the tool or the cup which God used. Now, Babylon itself will be shattered. Jeremiah 51:24 tells us that the judgment will be especially severe because Babylon's evil deeds against the people of Israel. He says here, and I will render unto Babylon and to all the inhabitants of Chaldea all their evil that they have done in Zion in your sight, says Jehovah. Now, because Babylon has ruled the world, or ruled the entire world ruinously, God will now destroy her that had destroyed so many. And Jeremiah 51:25 to 26, 25, behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain. And again, whenever the word mountain is used symbolically, it refers to a kingdom. I am against you, O destroying mountain, says Jehovah, which destroys all the earth. And I will stretch out my hand upon you and roll you down from the rocks, and I'll make you a burnt mountain. Babylon will be so destroyed that there'll not even be a stone left. Not even a stone will be taken from her to be used for the corner or a foundation of any other place. But you shall be desolate forever, says Jehovah. Now, Jeremiah 51, verse 29, the results of God's decree is that the land trembles and is in pain. The reason is that the purposes of Jehovah shall be performed against Babylon. He has decreed Babylon's destruction, and this decree stands and will not be repealed. It cannot be repealed. Therefore, Babylon will become desolate and without inhabitant. Again, Jeremiah points out in chapter 51, verses 35 to 36, that the necessity of this judgment will be due to Babylon's treatment of the Jews. In verse 35, they complain about the crime of Babylonia. The inhabitants of Zion, Jerusalem, will say, let the violence done to me and my flesh be upon Babylon. Jerusalem will say, my blood be upon the inhabitants of Chaldea. This deals here with the crime of Babylon in their treatment of the Jews. The destruction of Babylon will bring about great rejoicing among the faithful, and it is viewed as God's vengeance against Babylon for the mistreatment of the Jewish people. In Jeremiah 51, verses 48 to 49, there is rejoicing over the fall of Babylon. As Babylon has caused the slain of Israel to fall, so at Babylon shall fall the slain of all the land. Again, the reason here is for the mistreatment of the Jews. The prophecy of Babylon's destruction closes now with a description of the results of Babylon's fall in Jeremiah 51, verses 54 to 58. In verse 54, we have a cry of destruction. The sound of a cry is heard from Babylon, and great destruction from the land of the Chaldeans. The land of Chaldea is being destroyed down to every man, and the land is becoming desolate. The cry of Babylon can be heard in the surrounding territories. In verse 55, we see the invasion of Babylon is described as her waves roar like great waters, and the noise of their voice is uttered. The figure of a flood used symbolically, it symbolizes a military invasion. In verse 56, for the destroyer has come upon her, even upon Babylon, and her mighty men are taken. Their bows are broken in pieces, and destruction is in full. And in verse 58, the prophecy proper ends with a statement of the destruction of the city. The broad walls of Babylon are utterly thrown down. To seal these prophecies, Jeremiah performed a physical act that had a symbolic significance. And this act is described in chapter 51, verses 59 to 64. In verse 60, Jeremiah wrote in a book or on a scroll all the evil or calamity that would come upon Babylon. And this book was to be read in Babylon. Verse 63. And it shall be when you have made an end of reading this book that you shall bind a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates. And you shall say, thus shall Babylon sink and shall not rise again because of the evil that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. So, once Babylon is destroyed in the future, it will never be rebuilt again. Now, a copy of Jeremiah 50, verse 1 to 52, verse 58 was written. It was written on a scroll, and it was tied to a rock. And after having been read before the Jewish exiles in the land of Babylon, it was cast into the Euphrates River. Now, what was this all about? Just as the scroll sank, so Babylon will sink. There are two indications here that the king of Babylon, who is the Antichrist, will not be present in the city when his capital is destroyed. And the first we find in Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 43. The king of Babylon has heard the tidings, and his hands waxed feeble. Anguish has taken hold of him, and pangs as of a woman in travail. So that's the first passage, Jeremiah 50, verse 43. The second one is Jeremiah 51, verses 31 to 32. One post shall run to meet another, and one messenger to meet another, to show the king of Babylon that his city is taken on every quarter, and the passages are seized, and the reeds they have burned with fire, and the men of war are affrighted. So what we see here is that if messengers must be sent to tell the king of Babylon that his city is destroyed, then he will not be there when it happens. So where is he? If he's not in Babylon, where is he? By comparing the scriptures of the first stage of the campaign of Armageddon with those of the second stage, it would appear that while the Antichrist is meeting his forces in the valley of Jezreel, remember, down there near Megiddo, in the valley of Jezreel, his enemies now take the opportunity to gather and to destroy his capital city. Now, prior to the destruction of Babylon, the Jews still living in the city are warned to flee before it is too late. And this warning comes several times in the prophecy of Jeremiah. The first time is in chapter 50, verses 6 to 8. Verse 8 says, "Flee out of the midst of Babylon and go forth out of the land of the Chaldeans." A second warning is given in Jeremiah 50, verse 28. "The voice of them that flee and escape out of the land of Babylon, to declare in Zion the vengeance of Jehovah our God, the vengeance of his temple." So what we see here is that those who escape from Babylon are going to flee to Jerusalem to announce Babylon's destruction to the Jews who are dwelling there. This is God's vengeance because of Babylon's mistreatment of the Jews, and his vengeance for his temple because of the sinful act of setting up the abomination of desolation. A third is found in Jeremiah 51, verses 5 to 6. "Flee out of the midst of Babylon and save every man his life. Be not cut off in her iniquity, for it is the time of Jehovah's vengeance. He will render unto her a recompense." God's vengeance is about to be poured out against Babylon. So the Jews are now told to flee, or they will also fall prey to this vengeance. Now, as in Jeremiah 50, verse 28, those escaping will go to Jerusalem to declare what God has done, according to Jeremiah 51, verse 10. "Jehovah has brought forth our righteousness. Come and let us declare in Zion the work of Jehovah our God." This is now followed by a fourth warning in 51, verse 45. "My people, go ye out of the midst of her and save yourselves every man from the fierce anger of Jehovah." Fifth and final warning is in 51, verse 50. "You that have escaped the sword, go ye, stand not still. Remember Jehovah from afar, and let Jerusalem come into your mind." So, in this final warning to flee Babylon before her destruction, the Jews are also instructed to make their way to Jerusalem to inform the people there. Now, prior to the sudden and great destruction of Babylon, the Jews will be given a warning to leave Babylon, and they will succeed in their escape and will make their way to Jerusalem. These prophecies of the destruction of Babylon have never, ever been fulfilled in the manner required by the statements of scripture that we've seen here. As Daniel chapter 5 to 6 shows, the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon intact, with Belshazzar being the only casualty. Babylon as a city continued to exist, and Daniel was even given the position of authority within the city. So the Babylon of past history slowly died out and became a ghost town. Also, the final destruction of Babylon is clearly associated with the final regeneration and restoration of Israel. Such events have never happened in connection with ancient Babylon. Now, regarding the regeneration of Israel, Jeremiah chapter 50, verses 4 to 5 states, "In those days and in that time, says Jehovah, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together. They shall go on their way weeping and shall seek Jehovah their God. They shall inquire concerning Zion with their faces thitherward, saying, Come ye, join yourselves to Jehovah in an everlasting covenant that shall not be forgotten." Now, what we see in these verses is that the destruction of Babylon is said to come at the same time that Israel is seeking Jehovah her God and is entering into an everlasting covenant with him. Now, this covenant is the new covenant of Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. The destruction of Babylon is associated with the destruction of Israel, with the restoration. The destruction of Babylon is associated with the restoration of Israel in Jeremiah chapter 50, verses 19 to 20. And I will, this is verse 19, and I will bring Israel again to his pasture, and he shall feed on Carmel and Bashan, and his soul shall be satisfied upon the hills of Ephraim and in Gilead. In those days and in that time, says Jehovah, the iniquity of Israel shall be sought for, and there shall be none. And the sins of Judah, and they shall not be found. For I will pardon them whom I leave as a remnant. So Israel is now viewed as restored in her land with all her sins forgiven, so that no one will be even able to find her sins anymore. This restoration is going to be a result of the destruction of Babylon and can hardly be true of the ancient city. Now, all these things point to the fact that the city of Babylon is to suffer destruction at the time of Israel's regeneration. So this requires Babylon's destruction to come during the campaign of Armageddon. And this in turn requires the city of Babylon to be rebuilt. Another passage dealing with the destruction of Babylon is Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 to 24. Now, this chapter deals specifically with political and economic Babylon that will be ruling the world for 3.5 years. The passage begins with a declaration of the fall of Babylon in Revelation 18, verses 1 to 3. After these things, I saw another angel coming down out of heaven, having great authority, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, and is become a habitation of demons, and a hold of every unclean spirit, and a hold of every unclean and hateful bird. Verse 3, for by the wine of the wrath of her fornication, all the nations are fallen, and the kings of the earth committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth waxed rich by the power of her wantonness. Now, with its destruction, Babylon is to become a habitation of demons. It will be a place where fallen angels will be confined during the Messianic age, and that's in verses 1 to 2 of Revelation 18. Now, this is hardly true of Babylon today. The reason for this severe judgment of Babylon will be the global political, which are the kings of the earth, and economic, which are the merchants of the earth, corruption originating in this city because of Antichrist's rule. So we have the kings of the earth, that's the global political leaders, and then we have the economic, which are the merchants of the earth, associated here with the Antichrist rule from Babylon. Now, as in the Jeremiah prophecies, Revelation chapter 18, verses 4 to 5 reveals that there will be a call to the Jews to flee the city prior to Babylon's destruction. And I heard, verse 4, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come forth, my people, out of her, that you have no fellowship with her sins, and that you receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached even unto heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Now, what we see here is that the cup of Babylon's iniquity will then be full. Unless the Jews become subject to Babylon's judgment, they are now urged to flee, and this they will actually do. Now, the indictment against Babylon is given next in verses 6 to 8 of Revelation 18. Babylon is condemned to receive double the punishment she inflicted on others. And in verse 6, it speaks about double unto her the double according to her works. In the cup which she mingled, mingle unto her double. Because this city, through the counterfeit Trinity, will vaunt itself against the God of heaven. Verse 7, it tells us that. For she says in her heart, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall in no wise see mourning. It will suffer because she's puffed herself up against God. It will suffer a swift and sudden destruction by fire. Verse 8 tells us, in one day shall her plagues come, death and mourning and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire. Now, after Babylon's destruction, there's going to be intense lamenting by those who invested heavily in her, those who became rich by her, but now will be bankrupt by her ruin. And three classes of people will mourn over Babylon, and their lamentation is recorded in Revelation 18, verses 9 to 19. First is the lamentation of the kings. These are the political rulers of the world in chapter 18, verses 9 to 10. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived wantonly with her shall weep and wail over her when they look upon the smoke of her burning. Verse 10, standing afar off for the fear of torment, saying, woe, woe, the great city, Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour is your judgment come. So these are the 7 kings who have co-reigned with the Antichrist and who were the ones who submitted their authority to him as the king of Babylon. Whatever power or authority that they held was held by the grace of Babylon. And seeing their authority vanishing with the city's destruction, they will lament the swiftness of the judgment. They'll be able to see the smoke of Babylon afar off, for they will see it from the valley of Jezreel in Israel. Remember, they're down there gathering together. The second group of mourners are the merchants in chapter 18, verse 11 to 17. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her, for no man buys their merchandise anymore. Verse 15. The merchants of these things who were made rich by her shall stand afar off for the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning, saying, woe, woe, the great city, she that was arrayed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and decked with gold and precious stone and pearl. Verse 17, for in 1 hour so great riches is made desolate. The end of Babylon. Babylon will become the economic center of the world, the center of business and world trade. But it will suddenly go up in smoke, and the wealth of the merchants will be no more. They will swiftly becoming paupers. They'll be heard lamenting, weeping and wailing. The transporters of goods are the third group who benefited from their association with Babylon, but they too will lament, as we see in the second part of verse 17 down to verse 19. And every shipment and every one that sails any whither, and mariners and as many as gained their living by the sea, stood afar off and cried out as they looked upon the smoke of her burning, saying, what city is like the great city? And they cast dust on their heads and cried, weeping and mourning, saying, woe, woe, the great city, wherein all that had their ships in the sea were made rich by reason of her costliness, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. Since the merchants no longer have goods to market, the transporters will no longer have merchandise to transport, by which they become rich. So they will lament greatly the sudden destruction of Babylon. Now, while 3 groups are in mourning, there will be 3 other groups rejoicing. Revelation chapter 18, verse 20 tells us, rejoice over her, you heaven, and you saints, and you apostles, and you prophets, for God has judged your judgment on her. So there's going to be lamenting in the earth by the kings, by the merchants, by the transporters, but in heaven, there'll be 3 groups rejoicing, the saints, the apostles, and the prophets. The destruction of Babylon will mark the soon return of the Messiah. The passage now ends with a picture of the totality of Babylon's destruction in chapter 18, verses 21 to 24. And the strong angel took up a stone, as it were a great millstone, and cast it into the sea, saying, thus with a mighty fall shall Babylon, the great city, be cast down, and shall be found no more at all. Verse 23, for your merchants were the princes of the earth, for with your sorcery were all the nations deceived. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and of saints, and of all that have been slain upon the earth. So Jeremiah, remember, Jeremiah commanded a scroll-wrapped stone to be thrown into the Euphrates River to symbolize the sinking of Babylon. Now, what we see here in Revelation 18 is that an angel also cast a stone the size of a millstone into the sea to depict how Babylon will totally disappear so as not to be found anymore. That's verse 21. Babylon will cease to be the world's center and capital because she was guilty of the blood of the prophets. And for instance, the 2 witnesses. Remember, she was the one who killed the 2 witnesses in the tribulation period. And the slaughter of the tribulation saints as well. Verse 24. In the second stage of the campaign of Armageddon, while the Antichrist will, this is a bit of a summary, while the Antichrist will move his forces into the valley of Jezreel, his enemies will take the opportunity to destroy the city of Babylon, and it'll be quickly and suddenly. According to Isaiah chapter 13, verse 3, there'll be Gentile believers of the tribulation. Now, just prior to the destruction, the Jews will be warned to flee the city, and they'll make their way to Jerusalem to report to the Jews who are there. And this sudden destruction of the world political and economic capital will cause great distress on the earth, but not in heaven. For when Babylon's destruction occurs, it will signal that the second coming is at hand, and along with it, the regeneration and restoration of Israel as a whole, as a people. Now we see the third stage, which is the fall of Jerusalem. Now, the Antichrist will have all his allied forces with him when he receives the news that his capital city has been destroyed. But he doesn't move eastward to fight his enemies. No, because remember, Satan is in control. And it is Satan's program of Jewish destruction that is going to be uppermost in his mind. So instead of moving east, the Antichrist will move south against Jerusalem. And Zechariah described this third stage of the campaign of Armageddon in 2 places. The first place is Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. In Zechariah 12, 1 to 3, this is what he says: the burden of the word of Jehovah concerning Israel. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of reeling unto all the peoples round about, and upon Judah also shall it be in the siege against Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in that day that I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all the peoples. All that burden themselves with it shall be sore wounded, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered together against it. Second description we find in Zechariah 14, verses 1 to 2. Behold, the day of Jehovah comes, when your spoil shall be divided in the midst of you. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So from the Jezreel Valley, the armies of the Antichrist will now move south, and all the forces of all the nations will gather against Jerusalem. Once again, the city is going to fall into Gentile hands, and half of the Jewish population is going to be taken into captivity, into slavery, while the other half will be allowed to remain in Jerusalem to await a later fate. The capture of Jerusalem by the forces of the Antichrist will not come easily. God is going to energize the Jews to withstand the attack to a great degree. And that's going to cause heavy losses to the armies of the Antichrist. Now, Zechariah 12, verse 3 states that all these nations that burden themselves with Jerusalem will be sorely wounded, and Jerusalem will become truly burdensome to them. The empowerment of the Jewish forces is described in Zechariah 12, verses 4 to 9. These verses describe God's providential dealings at this stage of the campaign of Armageddon, prior to the actual intervention by the personal return of Yeshua, the Messiah, Jesus the Messiah. Zechariah 12, verse 4, in that day, says Jehovah, I will smite every horse with terror and his rider with madness, and I'll open my eyes upon the house of Judah and will smite every horse of the peoples with blindness. Verse 6 says, in that day will I make the chieftains of Judah like a pan of fire among wood, and like a flaming torch among sheaves, and they shall devour all the peoples round about, on the right hand and on the left. And they of Jerusalem shall yet again dwell in their own place, even in Jerusalem. So, in the battle for Jerusalem, the Jewish military leaders will be so energized that they appear to strike down the enemy as quickly as a torch begins to burn up the wood that is very dry. Now, Zechariah 12, verse 7 says, Jehovah also shall save the tents of Judah first. In verse 8, in that day shall Jehovah defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and he that is feeble among them at that day shall be as David. So the feeble among the Jews, they're going to take on the strength of David. This is King David. And the Davids among them take on the strength of the angel of Jehovah. Now, at this point in verse 9, it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. So God will begin in destroying the nations that have come against Jerusalem. Here we see in Micah, we see the energizing of the Jewish forces in the battle for Jerusalem. Micah chapter 4, verse 11 to Micah 5, verse 1. The nations are going to be assembled against Jerusalem. In verse 11, it says, and now many nations are assembled against you. This is against Jerusalem, for the purpose of destroying it. But in the course of doing so, they'll become like sheaves on the threshing floor. For he has gathered them as the sheaves to the threshing floor, and the Jewish forces will be able to thresh them as well. However, eventually the battle will be lost, and the Gentiles will capture the city and symbolize their victory by smiting Jerusalem's leader on the cheek. Yeah, this is in chapter 5, verse 1. Now shall you gather yourself in troops, O daughter of troops. He has laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek. So after such heavy fighting and great losses, the soldiers of the Antichrist will plunder the Jewish homes of Jerusalem, and Jewish women will be subjected to massive rapes, as Zechariah 14:2. And with this, the third stage of the campaign of Armageddon will now come to an end. And then we come to the fourth stage. The fourth stage, here we see the armies of the Antichrist. Now, we already showed that in previous study, that the main concentration of Jews and Jewish leaders will no longer be in Jerusalem or in Israel. Actually, they're going to be in a place called Basra, and that's located in the land of Edom. Now, Edom is present-day southern Jordan. Remember, Basra that's the Hebrew name. The Greek name for it was Petra. Now, since the main purpose of the campaign of Armageddon is to annihilate the Jewish people, the armies of the world will move southward from Jerusalem down to Basra. And this we find in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 13 to 14. For I have sworn by myself, says Jehovah, that Basra shall become an astonishment, a reproach, a waste, and a curse, and all the cities thereof shall be perpetual wastes. I have heard tidings from Jehovah, and an ambassador is sent among the nations, saying, gather yourselves together and come against her, and rise up to the battle. So the nations of the earth, these are the Gentiles, will gather at Basra in order to destroy the remnant of Israel that will be in hiding there. And you can find that from Micah chapter 2, verse 12, that they're now in hiding in Basra. And with the completion of the fourth stage, the last 3 days before the second coming begin. And this is where we will leave it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong. And we'll continue in the next session next week. Thank you. God bless and bye.